Good morning, everybody. Bright and early this morning. Welcome. Thank you for attending. Our 5-year out session for the Communication Ethics Division is entitled Our Foundation and Our Future, Communication Ethics Division Contributions and Challenges in This Time of Change. I'm Melissa Cook from St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and I'll introduce my panelists after a brief introduction. This panel is comprised of Communication Ethics Division members who have either contributed to the establishment of the original commission or who are current members continuing to shape our division. Through a discussion of the historical development of the division, including contributions to the academy and the community, the conversation will then focus on the challenges ahead in this time of change. This panel will celebrate communication ethics theory and praxis in our daily lives. The NCA requested that divisions prepare panels to discuss aspects that include how divisions were created, the instrumental scholars in our field, and their contribution to the discipline. To answer that call, members of this division created the panel to discuss history, themes, and contributions, like I said, both to the academy and the community. This discussion is important as communication ethics can be viewed as interdisciplinary, practical, and relevant in today's society. In many facets of our daily lives, borne out in every media outlet possible, we see the political, economic, and intercultural subtleties that might be affected by how communication ethics is discussed, viewed, and absorbed in our culture. We have an interesting history, a solid contribution of scholarship and valuable resources and voices in our commission and now division that has been active in the NCA, helping with important milestones, including the writing of the NCA Credo for Ethical Communication, formally adopted in 1999. This panel is significant as it highlights the historical importance of our division and illuminates a vision for the future. As we continue to influence the NCA, as well as local and global ongoing conversations relative to negotiating with others through multiple narratives, diversity, and sometimes complex social, political, and economic conditions. Our panelists today include Ronald C. Arnett from Duquesne University, who will discuss perhaps where our research needs to go. Dr. Clifford Christians from the University of Illinois, who's going to discuss the problem of relativism. Patrick Gerke, our outgoing president of the division from the University of South Carolina, he will discuss themes and contributions of the division. And our next vice president, Annette M. Holba from Plymouth State University, who will discuss communication ethics and pedagogy. We'll begin with Dr. Annette. Thank you.
Pardon me as I switch my glasses and I read from this. This is a project that's still in process, and I've changed it since the hard copy, and so I want to work with the computer on this particular piece. And the tentative title at this moment is Communication Ethics Scholarship and its Pragmatic Twin. This essay describes a postmodern turn, positioning communication ethics at a crossroads point, a moment in which the partnership of scholarship with those doing conflict studies becomes a pragmatic necessity. This essay affirms the continuing theoretical development of communication ethics in this postmodern moment of what would be called narrative and virtue contention at a descriptive level. Additionally, this essay assumes that once any communication ethic is engaged in a prescriptive fashion, it is likely to invite or more strongly cause a conflict to immediately or eventually emerge. In a postmodern culture, one of the salient reasons for studying communication ethics is that it is often knowingly or otherwise, it becomes a warrant for the introduction of conflict. Ironically, this postmodern reality frames a pragmatic warrant for the study and the understanding of conflict and its relationship with communication ethics. This essay is a preliminary effort to sort out the pragmatic connection between the study of communication ethics and conflict studies in a time of narrative and virtue contention. I'm going to pause for a moment and cease reading and try to describe this a bit. I'm working from a presupposition of philosophical hermeneutics from the vantage point of Hans Gadamer. Hans Gadamer presupposes that as we engage a text in terms of an interpretive fashion, it begins from an issue of a bias or a prejudice. He does not use those terms in pejorative fashion. He uses those terms in terms of inevitable fashion, that we cannot stand above history and have an Archimedean point from which we can make judgments that will stand universally for time. So what happens is that as you gather a given position, it then begins to, in a sense, in one of the essays I've penned, I talk about the issue of tainted ground, that what communication ethics provides is a form of tainted ground. Or otherwise, what we begin to do is to use it as a weapon against one another in terms of saying this is ethical and that is unethical. One of the things that is happening in terms of communication ethics for me, it is both, in my judgment, increasingly important and simultaneously dependent on partnership. And it is important because what we're needing to do is to figure out, in a sense, the ongoing bias or prejudice from which the I works and from which the other works. Charles Taylor has made this statement: the ongoing development of the remainder of the 21st century is really driven by a content form of education in which we literally must learn about ourselves and others. Communication ethics is a form of content. It's not simply a process. I'm certainly aware of the work of Habermas, and Habermas is moving more toward content himself in terms of the way in which he is describing that work. And one of the things that becomes important is to understand the tainted ground that communication ethic provides and its inevitability in terms of conflict. But I want you to hear that I'm deeply supportive of the study of communication ethics. However, I do not think a communication ethic has the likelihood of solving much. I think a communication ethic has the likelihood of describing much. It is the beginning of the conversation. It is not the end. So to study communication ethics as the end of the conversation, in my judgment, is now missing the point in this kind of time of contention. And the elements that happened at Fort Hood are just simply another ongoing example of the kind of struggles that are not only with us, they are going to increase in the remainder of the 21st century. This essay works within the demands of this moment, this time, tending to the conflicts that give identity to this era. This surveillance effort takes a clue from the world around us. This form of consideration has multiple names, attending to the historical moment that's tied to philosophical hermeneutics, meeting existence before us, coming out of a different philosophical tradition, and more recently being part of a larger environmental ethic. Working from a position that is environmentally responsive requires us to admit that we are unable to discern the ethical position that should guide us. And we witness daily the connection between taking an ethical stance and the generation of conflict. In an effort to be responsive to the world within which we are situated, one must reject the impulse to impose a prescriptive assessment upon the world before us. By the way, I cite Pat Gerke on that particular point in a recent essay that he has that's forthcoming. We must listen to existence first, not simply to a theoretical presupposition that demands conformity. Conformity, by the way, not of us, but of existence itself. And Burke talks about this in the recalcitrance of existence. We are right in the midst of it. When we listen to existence first, we attend to a world of conflict. For instance, in the last 3 years, you out in the audience can name multiple mass killings that have generated publicity and have devastated families. If one understands this pragmatic interplay of ethical positions and conflict, we now need to find a dwelling place for our scholarship. And my contention is the dwelling place for that scholarship is in the intersection of conflict and ethics. And by the way, I don't want to presuppose that this presupposition is novel, nor do I want to presuppose that no one has pointed in this direction previously. One of the people who has done this is Alistair McIntyre, with a variety of ways in which he talks about rival positions, and particularly with the title of one of his books, Whose Justice, Whose Rationality? And one can, my approach to this does not align with McIntyre's. I'm very supportive of McIntyre's scholarship, not necessarily of his conclusions. My entrance into this conversation is incredibly pragmatic. It's not driven by the issue of whether or not I like the world that I'm situated in. It is driven by the presupposition that I'm in this world, like it or not. The struggles over the types of economic structures, religions, competing traditions, etc., in this particular point to the issue of the necessity of understanding ethics in conflict studies as fraternal twins. And to be unresponsive to this moment is indeed problematic. I'd like to, if I can, take just a bit more time. I'm going to switch down here and try to frame for you in communication terms how this works. It's easier when one is flipping pages. The movement in terms of this essay is to move from the issue of the presupposition of communication as process and moving in the direction of the element of content related to communication ethics. That's not in the field of communication. Stan Dietz made that point with Interpersonal a number of years ago. So the issue of stressing the importance of a communication ethic, not as a process but as a content. The best way I can describe it is that it is a good. That a communication ethic is what you attempt to, and this is coming from the book on communication ethics, literacy, dialogue, and difference, that it is a good that one attempts to protect and promote, and that particular good is then propelled becomes a communication ethic. And when one works with that presupposition, one assumes that there is not one particular communication ethic, and then I'm just going to, for the sake of time, I will end with this quote from this essay. The moral of this assertion, and I lay out 5 points, and the moral of this assertion is that a communication ethic does not solve problems. In fact, a communication ethic is often at the epicenter of a conflict. It is its root cause.
Thank you. Dr. Christians, I believe, asked to go last, so we'll jump over to Dr. Gerke.
Got it.
Okay.
So that's what we had agreed.
We just didn't tell you.
I'll keep my comments relatively brief, but I do want to talk a little bit about the specific relationship I think that this division has and the work that goes on in this division has to the broader history of the discipline and this association, what is now the National Communication Association. In 1914, Charles Woolbert wrote an essay called The Ethics of Public Address, which was published in Public Speaking Review, which was the somewhat informal journal it claimed to be the journal of the Eastern Association in that year. And in many ways, Woolbert's essay represents something of the start of how ethics would be understood at the birthing of both the Eastern Association and the National Association. That it would have a twofold kind of focus, first and foremost, the ethics of pedagogy, the ethics of teaching public address and public speaking. How is it that we teach students to be ethical and responsible speakers? And second, to stand as bulwark against unethical public address and the concerns of demagoguery and charlatanism. For a budding discipline concerned with its role as a pedagogical field in the teaching of public speaking, which really was the orientation and understanding of what this discipline was about in the teens and 20s even, the question of how we validate or vindicate this kind of education in light of what people do with it was of some significant concern, and hence ethics erupts on the scene early on. However, the concern here is mostly quite facile. The application tends to be an importation in these early years of largely psychological and psychopolitical kind of orientations of people like Dewey and James, and it's not until really many years later that American communication scholars within our association would set forth for themselves their own foundations and make arguments that really today we would recognize as being something other than simply ethical dogma. As the discipline turned increasingly toward analyzing and critiquing its own foundations with the emergence of existential philosophy in the 1950s and 1960s, the expansion of methodological systems across rhetoric and quantitative and other elements of the field in the 50s and 60s, the interruption of the consistency of method, both by social scientists and by rhetorical critics such as Ed Black, the question of ethics and the question of politics shifted not only from pedagogy but also towards research in the discipline. What is it that all of our research does in terms of how it informs ethics and in terms of how we are ethically informed in the conduct of the practice of not only our teaching but our publication and research? It is after the climate of these initial confrontations within our association and what is now our discipline, that the Communication Ethics Division was born quite late, really, in many ways, to the conversation that had been going on. The question, of course, that it seems that this history puts before us is why a division for communication ethics? There is no doubt that one has never been able to talk about or study communication without involving questions of ethics and politics, at least for as far back as our histories trace, whether you want to go back to the arguments between Isocrates and all the people who lived much shorter than him, or you want to talk about Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, or you want to talk about Foucault's History of Sexuality. One could never talk about discourse, communication, speech, etc., without being bound up in the question of what ought I to do, where are my responsibilities, what are my obligations, and how shall I constitute an ethic. So why would one possibly need a division, as this would cut across every element of the discipline? Now, rather than answer this particular question historically, I want to try perhaps something of a rough summarization of what I've seen in terms of the strengths and diversities and unique contributions of this discipline as an embodied community in roughly the past 15 years since I first found it as a graduate student and suddenly realized there was someplace I could call home. First, I think we have to recognize that there is a value to bringing together a breadth of questions in ways that may not happen if you are focused on an object of analysis, as many of our structures of intellectual engagement often take: public address, interpersonal, intercultural. The questions can harken back to those early 20th centuries, and we continue to ask them. How do we practice communication and particularly persuasion ethically? How do we teach ethics to our students? What standards might be used to determine ethicality? How can one apply or deploy these standards? And that research certainly continues, but in a far less facile, a far less dependent kind of form. And much of that has to do with the fact that at least since the 1970s, people who are now in this division and have been in this division for some time and broadly across the discipline have been asking another network of questions. Fundamental questions such as, what are ethics? Why is there any such thing like ethics in communication at all? What can an ethic of communication do? And what do ethics cost you? That kind of diversity requires that you also have a methodological diversity. We are not a quantitative or humanistic or humanities division. We are a division instead that brings together philosophical, rhetorical, ethnographic, performative, quantitative, critical, qualitative, and any other iv or ism you might like to brand, because none can escape the fundamental fact that when one asks questions of communication, one asks questions of response, of responsibility, of obligation, and of both self-creation and co-creation, which would return us back to that ancient Greek notion of ethics as the dwelling place, the way in which one lives one's life. We also have a diversity of communication genres, people whose primary interest is in mass communication, whose primary interest is in interpersonal, whose primary interest is in rhetoric and public address. And in bringing these folks together around a central principle of ethics, or a central question of ethics, we find the way in which performances, practices, and discourses cut across these genres. This also means we have a subject matter diversity, not only in terms of the genres of communication, but in terms of particular subjects that individuals may take up, such as specific causes of social justice that inform some of our members' research and contributions to the division, specific bodies of philosophy that occupy the research of some of our members in the division. And when one comes to another, such as our frequent recurring conversations of the relationship between Levinas and projects of on-the-ground political social justice, each finds that it encounters a difficulty that it has previously thought it had handled quite well, and an opportunity for development and moving forward that would not occur without that kind of diversity. But there's also something deeply reflective about the practice of the members of the division in their consideration of ethics. They reflect on how we do scholarship, reflect on the question of the ethics of being a scholar of ethics. They reflect upon mentoring, upon our collegial relations, and perhaps in our less formal and less scholarly moments, such as last night, those reflections speak loudest about what it is that makes it so important to bring people together who are concerned with doing fundamental kinds of research on ethics, because they model for each other. And the teaching by modeling that can happen for graduate students gives us both a scholarship and an embodied practice that informs what it means to think about and do work and ask questions about ethics in a way that no printed page, I think, can bring. In a time of extraordinary anxiety about the discipline, and quite honestly, 1910 Eastern Association's founded. We're on the cusp of 100 years since the first association. And in reading through all of it, I can't find a year in which there wasn't extraordinary anxiety about the discipline. Right? But in that continued anxiety and these conversations about balkanization, I have to wonder what's going on in other divisions that don't see the kind of diversity, the kind of mutual informing, and that kind of profound reflective modeling that has made me committed to this division and has made it impossible for me to think about this as anything but home. That openness, I hope, will carry forward into the future of the division, and I hope carries forward in our conversations. But no matter how polemical any of us may become at a particular moment in a discussion of exactly what the distinction between the saying and the said may be, at that moment there is also always this incredible embrace that says, you are welcome here, and we know that the disagreement, the profound lack of coming to any ethic, the conclusion, is what makes it possible for the division to continue the contributions that it makes.
Thank you, Patrick. Dr. Gold. Thank you, Patrick. Your comments were incredible. I'd like to focus, and I will speak shorter. I'd like to focus on the teaching of communication ethics. I see our division as being instrumental in the development of communication ethics pedagogy that can enrich curricula across the nation. We've already begun in that pursuit, especially with the development of our website that Patrick worked on over the last year, couple years perhaps. And I see it only moving forward, and we just need to remain committed to it so that we can act as a place or a dwelling place for teachers of communication ethics to work together, to learn from each other, and to do good things with that. My department does not have a specific communication ethics course, though I do have the option every fourth year to create a special topics course in which I would probably go back and forth between communication ethics and philosophy of communication, both courses of which I could teach communication ethics in. So I also, though, teach communication ethics through our basic course of Introduction to Human Communication. And it's textbooks now often have communication ethics, as you know, threaded through, so it's not tagged on at the end. We're beginning to privilege it more. And so that's helpful for me to use a textbook and talk about ethics in every unit or chapter with my class, but that's not good enough because to me it still feels like it's tagged on at the end. So I always include some type of extra reader so that students have more than a textbook understanding of something where we can work with ideas at deeper levels. And for the last several semesters or 2 semesters, I've been using the Communication Ethics Literacy book by Arnett, Fritz, and Bell to give us that starting place to talk about communication ethics literacy and at much deeper levels. From that book, I can create projects which have been very enlightening for me as I see my students engaging in their own research at much deeper levels than just assigning them some research paper that doesn't have a particular focus. So students receive this portion very well of the course, and it's always on my course evaluations, at least the last 2 semesters. They find that to be the better part of the course. So they're hungry for communication ethics, to talk about it, to learn about it, to think about it. And we need to find ways that are good in teaching it to guide them through their hunger. What I think is very helpful is to have books like that, research, articles like that, that are theoretically grounded and praxis-oriented so that students understand how to take what they read and contemplate at deeper levels and then enact it
and experience it in their own lived experience. I've encountered, though, some challenges with expanding my research projects in this area, mostly because of the resources. So I'm hopeful that now that we have the link to all the articles on the Communication Ethics website, that will be helpful, and it will continue to grow. But I also see what would be helpful for us as a division to cultivate the pedagogy part of that website and include syllabi, rubrics, assessments. Let's network together and really think about how we can teach communication ethics to make it meaningful, and maybe model and live so that our students not only read the book and learn something, but also see it in the interaction that we have with each other. I'm hopeful that our division will inspire colleagues to become and or remain rigorous in doing communication ethics research, scholarship, in the tradition of our founders, so that we can continue to build the division, build our pedagogical resources, and continue our tradition of communication ethics as our historical moment continues to grow and develop. And I do see that the website that our division has now is a great starting place for that. I'm hoping to have more pre-conferences, short courses, all of those things, papers about communication ethics, pedagogy, to be kind of foregrounded in the future. As educators, scholars, researchers, we are charged with preparing the future students to go into the future and to not only work in the marketplace but also to live in the human community. Our students need the ground to engage that conflict that Dr. Arnett mentioned, where communication ethics is situated in that conflict, and it is our responsibility to teach and model for them. And I think what better place than our division to network with great teachers, thinkers, researchers, and scholars for us to help each other along. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Dr. Christians?
We have here an agenda for 5 years in research, scholarship, teaching. I believe I'll just sing the doxology and celebrate what my colleagues have said. I represent media ethics primarily, but as Patrick made so clear, one of the great benefits of this division, and what he insists we continue into the future, is the kind of inclusiveness that says, whether it's rhetoric or interpersonal or org com, which have dominated, have done the most theoretically interesting work in ethics in this division, you're welcome from popular culture or mass comm as well. I thought what I would do is a step outside of or alongside our various divisions and think out of meta-ethics for the next 5 years. And it seems to me that the premier challenge for 5 years out is relativism. And unless we deal with it philosophically, the future of communication ethics is limited. In terms of these extraordinary challenges, as Patrick suggests we're facing, one could arguably include a long list of incredibly important issues. But I at least want to put relativism on the floor as the supreme challenge we're facing now. It's a long-standing problem since Friedrich Nietzsche made it inescapable in the late 19th century. But in this first decade of the 21st century, relativism has reached maturity and has taken on a comprehensiveness that threatens our conceptual progress in ethics. In Nietzsche's terms, in a world where God has died and everything lacks meaning, morality makes no sense We live in an era beyond good and evil. There is no transcendent answer to the why of human existence. And we face the demise of moral interpretation altogether. For Nietzsche, morality has reached the end of the line. And his argument in 1886 continues. Defending a good beyond the senses is not beneficent, but imperialism over the moral judgment of diverse communities. So as we're challenged constantly to do our work internationally in its scope and character, this question of Nietzsche still needs to be answered. For relativists in the Nietzschean tradition, the right and valid are only known in local space and native languages. Judgments of right and wrong are accepted as such by their adherents' internal criteria. And therefore, these concepts and propositions are considered to have no validity elsewhere. For cultural relativism, morality is a social product. And since all cultures are presumed to be equal in principle, all value systems are equally valid. Cultural diversity now typically means moral relativism, contrary to an ethnocentrism of judging other groups against the dominant Western model. Other cultures are not considered inferior, only different. And in that sentence, one sees the power of a cultural diversity, cultural relativism model. All forms of public communication tend to exacerbate the problem of relativism. In my own field, the news media in particular emphasizes these specifics. Reporters work at the juncture of globalization and local identities, both of them happening simultaneously. The integration of these contradictory trends, homogeneity and ethnic self-consciousness, integrating them is a major necessity. But the journalist's penchant for everyday affairs makes integration difficult. And in our passion for ethnography, for diversity, for the local, academics in communication typically allow cultural relativity to slide into philosophical relativism. Now, the preoccupation in communication studies with narrative usually leaves relativism unattended. And maybe Ron Arnett's classic book, one of the great in our field on Bonhoeffer, has answered this question. That is, how can we do narrative and still have stories that live beyond the narrative and insist on, not as an adjunct, but integral to the story, something of permanence? But I'm suggesting as an overview here that our commitment to stories diverts us from the philosophical relativism problem. We know that through stories we constitute our ways of living in common. Moral commitments are embedded in the practices of particular social groups, and they are communicated through a community's stories. But narrative ethics is conflicted in its own terms about which value-driven stories ought to be valued. What in narrative itself distinguishes good stories from destructive ones? And Ron mentions Alistair MacIntyre, maybe his own work helps move us forward. But I'm putting the burden continually on us in communication that makes narrative so crucial to what we do. Because customs are relative, it does not follow that all are relative. While there are disagreements over details, policies, and interpretations, these differences do not in themselves mean that no moral judgments can be made about major historical events. The Holocaust, Stalinism, genocide, genital mutilation, Nazism, apartheid in South Africa, and so on. The challenge for communication ethics over the next 5 years in our global age is honoring cultural diversity and narrative and local stories and ethnographic accounts while simultaneously rejecting moral relativism. And how to do that in a way that says to Nietzsche, we can bespeak the local and the one at the same time without being imperialistic. When cultural pluralism slides into moral relativism, we usually have not faced up to the pernicious politics that insists on the prerogatives of a nation, caste, religion, or tribe. Cultural relativism turned into a moral claim is stultifying. If moral action is thought to depend on a society's norms, then we must obey the norms of one society, and to diverge from those norms is to act immorally. Ordinarily, social consensus does not indicate the wrongness of a society's practices and beliefs. Now, while continuing to critique relativism, and Mannheim had some great claims about it, you cannot be a relativist without rising above it, to assume that all relativism is wrong, and in the process of rising above it philosophically, you've made a category mistake, and therefore you're guilty of illogic. And the stultification issue is important to me as well. While continuing to critique relativism on its own terms, another need in metaethics is developing a credible version of realism. A valid realism is the antidote to philosophical relativism. And here's how, I believe, we could establish its possibility. Realism. Our creativity. I'm hugely hesitant to speak of relativism in a few minutes, and now to put this incredibly important issue of realism on the floor in a few as well. But let me at least state a possible dynamic realism that's unhinged from an Enlightenment view of objectivity, a static universe realism that might give us a way to proceed. Our creativity works within the limits of a given natural order, creative ability within a shared cosmos. Of course, people shape their own view of reality, but this does not presume that reality as a whole is inherently formless until it's defined by human language. A world that exists as a given totality is the presupposition of historical existence. Reality is not merely raw material, but is ordered vertically and through an internal ordering among its parts. Some kinds are hierarchical, subspecies within species and species within genus, but relations among humans are horizontal. There is no slave race to serve a master race. And the human species, given this view, will not mutate into something else. This coherent whole is history's source. an intelligible order that makes history itself intelligible. Following Aristotle's dictum, though in Greek speaking the truth of the matter, that is, there must be an unmoved mover to make sense of everything else. From a realist perspective, we discover truths about the world that exist within it. Ricoeur argues that the great philosophical problem is to decide whether values are discovered or created, and the social constructionist view has obviously chosen the latter route, and I'm arguing the former. This is ontological realism. It's inscribed in our very humanness. It does not appeal to an objective sphere outside our subjectivity. Among human beings are common understandings entailed by our creatureliness as lingual beings. All human languages are intertranslatable. In fact, some human beings in all languages are bilingual. All languages enable abstraction, inference, deduction, induction. All human languages serve cultural formation, not merely social function. All humans know the distinction between raw food and the cooked, a reference to Levi-Strauss. Of major importance in our philosophical work is legitimate realism, on this side of Einstein, Freud, and Darwin, and realism grounded in the ontological, expressed in human language, I believe, qualifies. So my summary paragraph. In terms of ontological realism, norms can be embedded within culture and history as an indicator of our distinctiveness. The human species creates, insists on, generates symbolic patterns along the boundaries between moral norms and actual behavior. The deepest self in our collective roles, the intentional and the inevitable. All human language enables us to organize our world around certain givenness that Polanyi would call intuitive knowing. In an ironic twist on conventional skepticism, through natural language, we establish the differences and similarities of people's worldviews. And normative claims that presume realism are therefore not a medieval remnant, but the catalyst for innovation. Given the ambiguities within relativism itself and the possibility of a constructive response through realism, theorizing in communication ethics can move forward constructively. So I put alongside of my colleagues' claims for our future work an attention, intellectual attention to relativism in the 5 years ahead. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dr. Fish. We'll open it up to questions from the audience. Please.
First, let me make a suggestion that I would like to hopefully see as a proposal being adopted. My suggestion is that we, as a group, and I came home. Thank you, Patrick. I truly came home. Mark and Cliff, of course, 1992. And I decided then this is not what I want. We're just talking, and it's not changing anything. But now it seems to me that we can move to a scholarship of activism. It seems to me from what I'm hearing right now. My suggestion is that we make a Facebook group. and I make that suggestion because just recently I decided to be living in the space of my students, in their virtual space. And what a wonderful, creative, lively, dynamic world that is. And it seems to me that this upcoming generation is not going to listen to our philosophical arguments as deeply as we did. They want operationalized ethics, operationalized philosophy, and we cannot do that without scholarship of activism. And the question of realism comes to play. Even the question of cultural relativism can be discussed in that mode more. A quick that's the suggestion that I make. But the reason why I made the suggestion is that as a person of multiple identities that are not in conflict with each other, except in the frictions that the dynamism of life itself requires. I see that we can move from, and Patrick I think touched upon this, to go even more international, to go even more global by making our division present on a more global platform. Facebook is the future of the open university, the open society, the global open society. It is the forum for tomorrow's civil rights movement, the global civil rights movement on which we have just, in my judgment, embarked. The process toward that is now taking root, and I would suggest that we be present there. My question for the panelists is how can we connect with the 18-year-old who is just completely disassociated, at some level disassociated with from us, and at some levels is looking for embodiment of values through their own process. We just spoke. Just heard as an active listener, I would say we just spoke of the I'm sorry to take that much time, but we just spoke of this concept of engagement in some sense. How can we get that young man engaged in our space? How can we seed ground and help them also seed ground so that our multiple identities as well would somehow come to a common ground, a global one? And I think we're moving toward that direction as jobs become less available here. The world becomes, I guess my question is as simple as what can we do with the upcoming generation?
Thank you.
Melissa?
Cliff, please.
What I'd like to do is ask colleague Ron to take the lead in answering. because he's been our specialist in nonviolence. And one of your concerns in Sudan as a diplomat is to take the principles of communication that you know from Islam, being an expert in Islamic ethics, and to make that work in a political and cultural situation of this horrendous 21st century disaster. And Ron says, if I heard him in his conclusion, ethics is only the first statement, right? It's never the answer in the last breath. But I would like to put my colleague Ron up front in dealing with a range of ethics, because you represent Islamic ethics, several of us Christian ethics. Maybe we have to work on monotheistic frames of reference ourselves to get that together to deal with the Palestinian issue, for example. Ron,
I just think the question, Cliff's comments, all the comments, point in the direction of a necessity of diversity. In the necessity of diversity, there needs to be multiple ways in terms of eco-finality, multiple ways to get to the same place. We'd like the world to be a place where human beings can thrive. We have not yet figured out the answer for that. I'll go, in terms of nonviolence, I'll go to Gandhi in terms of the difference between Duragraha and Satyagraha. Satyagraha is loving engagement. Duragraha is stubborn persistence. I think the danger of the issue of imposing one's own kind of answer is that it looks like Duragraha. Short term it works, long term it generates incredible danger. And I think I think the diversity is significant. I'm not on Facebook. I will not be on Facebook, and it's really driven by the issue of Arendt. And I'm finishing the book on Arendt, who does a critique of modernity. She's a Jewish woman coming out of World War II, and her comment is the first natural defense of a human being is to protect the difference of public and private discourse. And if you look at the work of Benabi's written a book on Arendt. The issue of the differentiation of public and private is an upper middle class presupposition that we can blur that into the social. And I think what we are doing in terms of Facebook is generating a capitalistic exploitation of the youth. And I think it's necessary for us to be able to say no. And it's my job at this stage of 57 to say it's not my job to have the youth tell me what to do. And it's not my job for me to tell them. It is my job to be as attentive as I can to existence and do my calling. If not me, then whom? And that answer needs to be addressed. But if not me, then whom is not driven by the origin of I. It's driven by a derivative I. That is responsive to existence. So the key is, and I'm not smart enough to know I'm right. I am smart enough to know in Gandhian terms that it's real important for me to choose a path, and if I screw up, thank God you chose another. Which is a pragmatic understanding of truth. But I think the agreement is that we're in troubled times, but I think the danger is for none of us to be able to say we've got the answer, because I don't think anybody does. But I do think that at times even the wrong answer, agreed upon by many, will move us in more constructive directions than the right answer imposed.
Jacina.
I'm so grateful for this, first of all. Oh, thank you so much. And this is all going to be published somewhere, I hope?
NCA was recording it for, we'll see what we can get it for everybody.
So wonderful. And something hits me. I'm thinking, gosh, do Appia and Maloof offer anything here in terms of dare I even use the word, you'll have to forgive me, but the word they're offering is cosmopolitanism. I understand the constraints and the issues and the philosophical and other challenges of that, but my sense is that implicit in, especially Appiah's approach, is this idea of the ontological center that I believe is so profoundly important to us at this moment, to challenge the kind of radical relativism, or what someone might even call trivial relativism, and simultaneously reject the crude absolutism that has gotten us into so much trouble globally for centuries. That they're calling for us to have simultaneously, as you're suggesting, this commitment to a shared understanding, some common ground, a very local, this is going to sound so bizarre, but local and situated construction of the Golden Rule, where the Golden Rule nevertheless is privileged across contexts, across cultures. And so they're offering a voice here. And I want to just put that in that what I take to be a profoundly important point about capitalist exploitation in this moment. And the amorality, the instrumentalism that O'Doul so prophetically warned against. And I honestly also share the conception of Facebook, at least as it exists now. It could take wonderful turns. It strikes me, potential, extraordinary potential, but at the moment has a real feel to me of this kind of amoral instrumentalism that is grounded in capitalist exploitation. Lots of jargon.
I just want to say one thing and let Cliff respond. The issue for me is driven by a rent. Her comment is go after anything driven by banality. And here's the issue. I have 200 friends. That's banality, extreme commonness.
I so hear you.
Thanks, Jesse. Cliff?
Ron, you should work for Madison.
It's so true. Don't forget the friends, Quakers friends. There's another way.
Yeah.
I'm only saying.
Yeah, but see, you don't know that I'm an Anabaptist. I'm a member of the Church of the Brethren, one of the 3 historic peace churches.
I understand.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Anabaptist. Well, you were directing it to the whole panel, but I'll make one comment and then we'll go down the road. One way, I believe, of making these issues that you're talking about paramount is to work on the concept of theory that we've carried over into our field. Patrick is eloquent about this being interdisciplinary, all-inclusive. It creates an intellectual home for people out of the humanities, history, philosophy, literary, comparative criticism, the social sciences, etc. And the boundaries of we need boundaries to have some coherence, but we're constantly negotiating. I think one advantage of that perspective is to say that theories are not just, in our case, single strand, rationally driven, mathematically verified, statistically valid, as the Enlightenment tended to say. Theories finally are self-evident truths. I guess I reflect in Descartes' version of theory, decontextual. Now, our field allows us to say our beliefs about the world, the nature of the human being, are issues that motivate us, that we're ultimately concerned about. In a technocratic age, the nature of humanity. So even though theories in Enlightenment terms that tend to be heavily epistemological. We say philosophical anthropology matters to us. There has to be a way of bringing presuppositions or worldview and faith commitments, not just as pre-theory. Well, you get that out of the way when you start really theorizing, but an essential part of it. Because we know that all theories are normative. They're not just self-evident truths. They're claims about the world or generalizations about it that we believe, or we wouldn't possibly promote them. But a presuppositional thinking and making that in terms of our theorizing not a negative or a weakness, but input. Patrick, what may you want to say more?
So I'll engage in the polemic a bit in terms of kind of both responses. I think that one of the fundamental things in terms of the contemporary age, if we continue to talk about ethics, is to give up on the idea that what we're after is something that would have unity or coherence. And probably the first things we need to dispose of are the law of non-contradiction and the standard of avoiding performative contradictions. Because I think if we have ethics or a possibility for ethics, it is in a schizophrenic way, a schizoethics. Because if you take something like Facebook, there is an enormous potential, and people are capable and have used it for significant social power. But at the same time, one must enter the fray there, recognizing full well that one is engaging in a commercialized, capitalist, and banal form, and at the same time that it's owned by an extraordinarily conservative group of people who give money out of its profits to Newt Gingrich's PAC and other similar organizations in California, and at the same time shut down people who have used it for union organization. But you know what? It's a dirty, ugly, nasty, messy kind of thing. And if you want to be an activist and have ethical concerns out in the world today, you're going to have to get your hands dirty. Now, that's the fundamental problem, I think, of living in the age of empire. That if there's going to be a space for ethics and a space for activism, it can't seek purity. And so if we want to ask the question of how do we talk about cosmopolitanism, it's without cosmos. Right? You have to give up on the idea of cosmos as the grounding principle of cosmopolitanism. And you ask how you engage the students today, it's without asking them for a theology or purity, but rather to accept the fact that they will be contradictory and let them live large and contain many worlds, so to speak. And ethics, I think, is the question of how you manage and negotiate the fact that you have to live in a contradictory space. And if there's an ontology, it's a schizophrenic ontology.
I would actually prefer to use a different phrase from Jewish theology, and that's a unity of contraries. In a sense, I don't think this is a schizophrenic age at all. I think this is a healthy moment. This is one healthy moment for the global community. We have zapped modernity. It's zapped. Praise whatever cosmos you want to say for this in terms of this historical moment. This is one great moment to be alive. And I tell my students that over and over and over. Modernity was wrong. It was a moral cul-de-sac. So this is a time of unity of contraries.
You need to be converted to Facebook.
Good luck.
And Ned had one last comment.
I have a very
conclude formally.
I have a very brief comment. First, when I think about getting that 18-year-old, the idea that I think about getting that 18-year-old to me has a violence connected to it because I feel like I'm imposing something like you need to think about this, or this is your ethic, or this is the only way we can think about ethics. So I really look for that starting place, and I'm going to, again, I hate to do this, but look at Arnett, Fritz, and Bell's idea that they tease through their ethics book on a minimalist error, where I have to look at that 18-year-old and say, you know, that we have some type of human experience in common, and we can start there and construct together with me as guiding, but yet not imposing, to get that student to find some type of relevancy within thinking about ethics and difference and that. And so that might work better for me. But I want to make a comment about Facebook, too, because I do see Facebook as very dangerous because of its idea of blurring the public and private. And I know that because I study Arendt. But I have to confess that I am just new to Facebook. And I use it because I have a new grandson, so I get to see his pictures often. But I will say that I coach the speech and debate team, and they have a Facebook page, and so I went to their Facebook page and I friended it, I guess, if that's what you say. And I so wish that I hadn't, because I see things I don't want to see. So now I blocked it, and I have to find other ways of connecting with those students. So that's just, I know Facebook has potential, but it does frighten me if we don't think about it. But it's our responsibility to help our students think about it.
Thank you all very much.